I'm Logan Crawford, and right now on Spotlight, we're taking a look at the profound world of prison chaplaincy with an amazing author, Reverend Don Stoesz. His book is called Transformative Moments in Chaplaincy. This insightful read celebrates the lives of Reverend Dr. Pierre and Judy Allard, 50 years of reconciliation ministry, highlighting key events that shaped corrections and chaplaincy in Canada and beyond. Today, we will discover the powerful stories of transformation, hope, and redemption that define this compelling narrative. We're delighted to have this very talented author join us here today on Spotlight. We thank the team at Atticus Publishing for helping us put him in the spotlight today. And we ask viewers like you to support authors like him by subscribing to our channel and by purchasing his amazing book. The links are below this interview. Reverend, thank you so much for joining us here today on Spotlight.
Thank you.
Pleasure's all mine, sir. Great to have you on the show. Tell us why you decided to focus on the Allard's reconciliation ministry.
Yeah, the reason is because I was in chaplaincy for a long time, almost 35 years. And what you do when you're in a job for a long time, a career, what happens is that you start looking at the resources that why did I get into chaplaincy in the first place? And you need resources, religious resources in my case, to be able to continue to sustain our ministry. And when I looked at Dr. Pierre Allard's doctoral thesis in 1983, he looked at the biblical justice. He looked at reconciliation ministry in the book of Ephesians and 2 Corinthians. He looked at, was it possible to have reconciliation between two people, such as offenders and victims? And so I think that is really what drew me to his work. He was a national leader, a director of chaplaincy in Canada for 20 years. He changed the face of corrections by having a mission statement. And then they spent the last 15 years in Rwanda. With reconciliation ministry. So he is a true leader together with his wife, Judy. And so I think for me, looking back at the end of my career, I'm looking at resources that really have sustained me in terms of continuing to look at healing and hope for prisoners.
Can you share a particularly impactful story from your book that highlights the importance of prison visitation and ex-offender reintegration?
That's right. Yeah, I think the first two books, I mean, it's interesting. There were an idealism in the 60s and 70s about possibilities of offenders to change, to be reconciled, to be reintegrated. And so across Canada, from New Brunswick to Halifax, to BC, to Alberta, to Manitoba, there were about 8 or 9 different agencies that just started visiting prisoners and seeing how they could work with prisoners and have reintegration. And so that is really kind of a moving of I'd say the Holy Spirit, kind of a providential moving of the Spirit that created this kind of initiative, and Allards were involved in that.
Allard's collaboration with the Correctional Service Canadian Commissioner also helped influence modern chaplaincy, correct?
Yeah, that is an amazing story. There were a lot of riots in prison in the 60s and 70s. And if you Google any of the prisons in Canada, you know, it was quite horrific in terms of staff being killed and inmates being killed. And so the corrections realized they had to change their idea. It's not a military operation. I mean, that was really in the 50s and 60s. It was like a military operation in terms of punishment. And so really, Pierre became friends with Ole Ingstrup, who was from Norway. He wasn't from Canada, and he had a fairly progressive view of corrections. And so they collaborated as friends and changed the face of corrections by saying that we need to treat inmates as human beings, as subjects, and actually intervene in their case and help them see whether they wanted to change. And that changed the face of corrections. There was a time maybe 10 years later, in 1998, Pierre Allard held a special meeting of the Correctional Service, and Ole Ingstrup asked him to do that, to say a prayer of thanksgiving that in 10 years, there were no prison staff that had been killed. And so that was really a momentous time that it showed that by treating inmates as subjects, somehow we could have a better correctional service in which staff were safe.
Tell us about some of the challenges the Allards faced while establishing just equipping and how they overcame those challenges.
I think they were natural leaders. And so they were president and executive director of International Prisons Chaplaincy Association for 10 years. So they had and they spoke French, they spoke English. So they had a natural connection into the international scene. And so they were invited to Rwanda. I mean, it wasn't as though they started that initiative. They were invited to Rwanda. The genocide in Rwanda had taken place in 1993. So these inmates had been in prison for already 15 years or 20 years. And so it was a matter of these hundreds and thousands of prisoners. They were going to be released at some point in Rwanda. And the victims were afraid. What was going to happen? Was there going to be retaliation? Were the offenders going to come back and kill some more people? And so that was really the initiative. Then Pierre and Judy, because they had worked in prisons, went to the prisons and said, look, do you want to actually, do you have remorse? Do you actually want to change? And so 450 offenders ended up writing letters asking for forgiveness from the victims. And so the Allards with their chaplaincy team spent 10 years from 2006 to 2016 delivering these letters to the victims. I mean, all over Rwanda. And out of that, 250 victims actually visited the prisoners in prison before they were released. And so really, I mean, that's a phenomenal story of change, of transformation. And in fact, some of the offenders ended up then helping tending the gardens and actually giving restitution to the victims when they went back into their communities.
Amazing, amazing. And I'm sure that's a transformative experience, especially for the victims. Instead of harboring the pain, the shame, the hate, they have forgiveness in their heart. And that changes their life, changes their perspective, and makes them less of a victim, right?
Yeah, I mean, it has to do with validation of the anger and the revenge or the sense of retribution that the victims had. And the inmates had already spent 15 years in prison serving their sentence. But what now? Is it just punishment? Isn't there something else that has to be done, especially if the offenders come back and are released? That causes a lot of tension in the villages. And so to have chaplaincy keep them safe and support, and that they can actually talk to each other, there's a sense of the tension just reduces. And the victims wanted to know this also for their own reasons. Who killed my father? Who killed my mother? Where are they buried? Why did you do it? Et cetera, et cetera. So there was also their own reasons why, besides the forgiveness, they wanted to know actually what happened.
Amazing, amazing. What message do you hope readers take away from Transformative Moments in Chaplaincy?
I think the fact that there were transformative moments is providential. That it doesn't happen it happens every 50 years. That in sense, the idealism that we had in the 1960s and 70s, I'm a little older, I guess I could remember back to that time,
yeah.
where the idealism was there to say, oh yeah, inmates are going to change, they have remorse, oh yeah, it's all going to be good. And so there was a sense of real idealism, which to me is why I wrote the book. And then when I researched all the movements, the social movements that were happening across Canada, they didn't collaborate with each other. They just started themselves visiting the young youth in Kingston and in Prince Albert and in BC. And suddenly they said, oh, well, we can move this together. Why don't we have an initiative about how we can help this? And that's how it grew. And so I think it's just providential. It's not something that happens every day. It's something that happened then. And then now, of course, I wrote it to document that historically, that's what happened. And not only the visitation, the corrections changed, and the reconciliation efforts of Allard. So there were three different really moments in which the transformation happened.
Amazing. It's an impactful book. I understand the anger of victims who want the offender punished, but I also see the value of rehabilitating people who are in prison, changing their lives, putting them on a better path, making them worthwhile members of society again, and taking this huge chunk of our population out from behind bars and putting them on a path to peaceful living is certainly God's work. And that's what you've worked at for quite a while, as well as the Allards. So I think spreading that message that transformation can happen is important. The name of this book is Transformative Moments in Chaplaincy. It is an insightful read. It celebrates the lives of Dr. Pierre and Judy Allard's 50 years of reconciliation ministry, highlighting key events that shaped corrections and chaplaincy in Canada and beyond. Reverend, thank you so much for joining us here today on Spotlight.
Thank you for having me.
I appreciate your time. Pleasure's all mine, sir. To the folks at home, I'm Logan Crawford, thanking you for your time this time. Until next time on Spotlight.